My name is Trinity Tran Nguyen, and I'm very honored to introduce Joshua Luna. Graduating from Savannah College of Art and Design with a Bachelor of Fine Arts and receiving an award for outstanding achievement in sequential art, Joshua Luna is a professional comic book artist, writer, and creator. His works explore themes like diversity in pop culture, racial hierarchies, institutional power, and the erasure of identity. Original works by Joshua Luna include Ultra, Girls, The Sword, and Whispers. He has also created art for Spider-Woman, Origin by Marvel Comics. Aside from working on his books, Joshua creates comic strips and other visual arts highlighting the Asian American experience, his Filipino American identity, and as well as social commentary on the current socio-political climate. Here, I would like to thank Asian American Alliance for fostering a safe space on campus where students are able to express and understand the nuances of their identity. And also, thank you for always being a home I can always turn to. I would also like to thank Gina Brown, Professor Toimer, Professor Villegas, Anna Pamachantan, the Women's Center, the Writers' House, and the Common Hour Committee for making this possible. With that being said, let's welcome Joshua Luna.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I want to thank Franklin and Marshall College for inviting me, and thank Trinity Tran Nguyen, Mark Villegas, Anna Pamachantan, and Catherine Twimmer for facilitating and proposing my talk. I'd also like to thank the Asian American Alliance, Alice Drum Women's Center, the Fulton Bank, Writers' House, New College House, and Ware College House for sponsoring this event. I'm very honored to be here. So my name is Josh Luna, and I'm a comic book writer, artist, and creator. Today, I'll be talking about my career and life experiences and how I use comics to process and explore the ways my racialization as an Asian American affects those experiences. You may be wondering why a comic book guy is giving an academic talk about race. After all, comics have long been viewed as an unsophisticated art form, even though it isn't. And I don't have a background in traditional academia or had access to ethnic studies in school. I've always been the kid who doodled in the back of the class and annoyed the teacher for not paying attention. In hindsight, I realized I always had a desire to learn. I just process information differently. I'm more of a visual learner, as you'll see from the slides I'll be showing today. But growing up, I didn't have the resources or accommodations to meet my educational needs. Instead, like many Filipino Americans, I was set on a path to join the military. Since my dad was in the US Navy, I was constantly being uprooted. I was born in California, then moved to Keflavik, Iceland, then Arlington, Virginia, then Sardinia in Italy, then Sicily, which meant I spent many of my formative years abroad, living on military bases. So the question, where are you from, always made my brain short circuit. When I was 15, we returned to Virginia permanently, and that's when my dad left us to start a new family. So as a young teenager, I was struggling with my dad abandoning us without warning, combined with the culture shock of leaving life in Sicily, where my everyday normal was narrow cobblestone roads, ancient buildings, orange groves, and an active volcano, and tiny cars and mopeds that stopped for goat crossings. I went to a small school on the Navy base called Dodds, which combined kindergarten through 12th grade in one building, so you pretty much knew everyone. Everyone watched the same TV shows because there was only one channel called AFN that didn't even have commercials, just military PSAs. And everyone wore the same clothes because we all shopped at the one store on base called the PX. So cut to me being thrust into the gladiator pit of the public American high school system, where I got lost trying to find my classrooms, fist fights broke out every day, the doors in bathroom stalls were removed due to rampant drug use, my clothes were embarrassingly outdated, and I saw gangs for the first time, even Asian ones. Even the buzz sound after each class sounded like a prison. It was a strange contradiction of being 100% American on paper, yet still feeling like an immigrant, an outsider who didn't know the social rules. Schools on Navy bases weren't racial utopias by any stretch of the imagination, believe me, but oddly, I felt more American living on those bases in other countries than I did in America itself. On base, it was us versus them, because the outsiders were the locals, and we were the insiders, even though we were technically the foreigners. So with the cocoon of military protection now gone, I really began to feel the claws of America's true social order being placed on me. But once again, I didn't have the tools or support system to process or even articulate any of this, not from school or from home. I didn't even have the time to process it, since we were too busy surviving. So I pushed past it, but the silver lining of my dad leaving us was that it meant I was no longer pressured into joining the military, which opened up my career options. So thanks, Dad. So while doodling didn't help me in high school, it did get me into art school. I attended SCAD in Savannah, Georgia, where I majored in sequential art, which is basically like majoring in comic books. And being in my element finally allowed me to succeed. I graduated magna cum laude and even received an award for outstanding achievement in sequential art. After graduation, I broke into the comic industry with a blind submission of my first comic book series, Ultra, co-created with my brother Jonathan under a joint pen name called the Luna Brothers. By the way, a blind submission means pitching your story without any references or inside connections to help introduce you to the publisher. Many blind submissions stay in the slush pile for that reason, so we were very lucky to get in that way. So Ultra, our debut book published through Image Comics, is a romantic comedy about a superheroine navigating her love life and career in a world where superheroes are more like celebrities, with agents, endorsement deals, and scandals. This might sound blasé now, but at the time in 2004, it was considered borderline sacrilegious to parody superheroes this way. We then created our second series, Girls, which did even better. It's a survival horror story about a small town that's invaded by aliens in the form of beautiful women that don't speak and only want to procreate with men in order to create clones of themselves, while murdering real women, thus revealing and exacerbating existing gender tensions into an all-out war. We created our third series together, The Sword, which is an action-adventure about a paraplegic college student whose family is murdered in front of her by three ancient demigods who are in search of a magical sword that grants the wielder super strength and rapid healing abilities, and is the only object that can kill them. This sets her on a brutal journey as she seeks revenge and the truth about her father. Then we did a short stint with Marvel for Spider-Woman Origins with writer Brian Michael Bendis. And finally, in 2011, I went solo with Whispers, a supernatural thriller about a man with OCD who's mysteriously granted the ability to leave his body in ghost form and manipulate people's thoughts. He wants to use it to win back his ex, but his attempt to escape his imagined demons only unleashes real ones. So basically, from the time I joined the industry, I was working almost non-stop, churning out issue after issue of stories. Our joint book properties soon got Hollywood's attention. Within our first year in the industry, our first book, Ultra, was adapted into a CBS TV pilot, starring Lena Headey as the lead actress, and co-starring Peter Dinklage. And this was way before Game of Thrones, so this sounds cooler now than it did back then. To be honest, it wasn't that good. The only resemblance they retained from the book was pretty much the title. And as much as I admire Lena Headey, the protagonist, Pearl Penalosa, was supposed to be Latina. But once again, I felt the pressure to move past it. How could I complain? One moment, I was just a regular art student, Then all of a sudden, photographers were being sent to where I live, and we were in magazines like Wizard and Complex, with subheadings claiming we were creating a buzz in the comic world and were living the dream. Our books were translated to French, German, Spanish, and Italian. We got a manager, then an agent from CAA, which is considered the top agency with a near monopoly of A-list agents. They represent stars like Beyonce, Tom Hanks, and Keanu. We were invited to comic conventions all over the country and even places like France, and having meetings with the biggest production companies and studios in Hollywood for book properties like Sony, 20th Century Fox, Ridley Scott's company, Brad Pitt's company, and so on. Celebrities courted us to collaborate on our book properties, taking us to fancy restaurants and their giant mansions. We then entered a shopping agreement with Bryce Dallas Howard and her father's company Imagine for our book The Sword, where they pitched the project to studios and other production companies on our behalf. That fell through, but then The Sword was optioned and developed by Lakeshore Entertainment, the people who made the Underworld franchise, who wanted to make not just one movie, but a whole trilogy out of the series. So big things were happening every month, and it was almost dizzying to keep up. I'm sure all this name dropping is eye-roll inducing, but I say this in order to take you inside the mind of a young Asian American artist who started with nothing and spent all his life dreaming of making it into Hollywood. I believe that the Hollywood dream was one book, one deal, one opportunity away. So why was I so miserable? I didn't realize that spending so many years forcing myself to ignore harmful experiences had taken a toll on me. And one of the biggest harms I was experiencing year after year came from my own brother. To the outside world, Jonathan and I were viewed as a thriving partnership. For over a decade, I forced myself to believe that too, because the reality was too difficult to face. Jonathan was emotionally, financially, and physically abusive to me. He punched me and pushed me around at home and at Comic-Cons, and told me I wasn't allowed to share my personal art on our shared social media pages, while he still shared his. He constantly exaggerated his contributions and diminished mine, so that for years, people didn't even know I was an artist. He also touted himself as a co-writer when he did little more than help with the plot. He set up our profit split at 7/30 in his favor, even though it should have been at 50-50, and only increased it to 40% after I practically begged. All checks and contracts went to him, which meant I was at the mercy of him cutting the check and deciding how much to give me. This allowed him to keep me off the Marvel contract completely. He prevented me from networking with other professionals and would threaten to cancel our deals whenever I disagreed with him, but make me be the one to deliver the bad news. But of course, made sure our expenses were split at 50-50. Except for the most important one, which was supporting my mom, it had always been a financial struggle since my dad left. But around the time the Luna Brothers career launched, my mom was fired from her job and needed financial support. My brother refused to help her, which meant I felt the strain of expenses far more than he did, all while earning less. Overall, the more power he got, the worse his behavior became. When I finally tried to leave our shared condo, he denied me access to our mortgage contract so that I couldn't leave. I had to get a lawyer to help me get out of the mortgage, and had to move out in a single day without warning him for fear of him becoming violent. Not only did I have to escape my home, but I had to sever business ties with him completely and lose all kinds of opportunities, including those amazing movie and TV deals. I had to leave so much of my life behind just to get away. I didn't come forward for many years, in part because I knew people would say, "Why would you let him do that to you? Aren't you bigger than him?" And that caused me shame, which he counted on. The truth is, he's my older brother, and I thought I had to respect him before myself. It took a long time for me to realize that the person who should be ashamed is not me, but him. So why was I miserable? Well, I'm sure now you have a pretty good idea. I had to put a lot of people first before prioritizing myself, and I found myself in my 30s feeling invisible, voiceless, erased and having to start over. I wanted justice and to take back my career and those stolen years. So I hunkered down and started creating a new unannounced series. It was very ambitious, especially considering I was doing both writing and art for it, like I had for Whispers. It was my grand opus. 3 years had passed, and the book was nowhere near ready. I would have had to complete way more issues, even before releasing it, to ensure I could release them on a monthly schedule, but that would take even longer. My triumphant return was looking less likely, and once again, I couldn't escape that familiar, horrible feeling of being voiceless and invisible. Feeling hopeless and in utter despair, I came to the painful realization that a comic book comeback wasn't enough to save me. I endured too much trauma, too much loss for a career win to be my panacea. I knew I had to do what I hadn't really done for decades, which was actually talk about the pain, feel the pain, the exact opposite of everything I thought I was supposed to do. So for the first time in my life, I went to therapy. It changed my life. Someone really listened to me. Okay, sure, I paid someone to listen to me, but being heard and understood and learning tools to reframe my way of thinking taught me how to start loving myself. The funny thing about loving yourself is that you suddenly begin to rediscover all the aspects of yourself you didn't know you were suppressing and hating. And for me, one of those big unexamined puzzle pieces was my Asianness, my Filipino-ness. I was so accustomed to suppressing my Asianness that I even did it with my therapist. Not once in our many sessions did I ever bring up the issue of race or my identity and experiences as an Asian man. She was a very kind, intelligent, and well-meaning person, but many people like me who aren't white can attest to the reluctance of discussing race with a white person, which my therapist was. We hope for white people's understanding and allyship, but more times than not, it triggers unpleasant feelings for them because ultimately they'd have to address their white privilege, and they don't want that to be taken away. So they express something similar to the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression. Except for acceptance, they tend to struggle with that one. So even when you're with a nice white person, broaching this topic always feels like a gamble, and the house usually wins. Plus, I had been making such great strides with my therapist in every area not involving my racialized experience, I didn't want to risk ruining it. I ended my time with my therapist, but she encouraged me to be my own therapist whenever I encountered difficulties. So I took that to heart and decided to work on it on my own, and I did what has always saved me: doodling. So for the first time in my professional career, I drew myself, or at least someone who looked like me. It was my first comic strip, exploring my Asian/Filipino identity, and it depicted one of the earliest moments I remember being racialized and othered. And so in 2016, I uploaded my first online strip to social media. Now, as I show you comics today, some of you might find it difficult to catch the finer details or read the dialogue due to size. But don't worry, I'll be showing the original full version of my comics first, and then individual panels separately to make sure it's legible to everyone. I should also mention that although I typically depict Asian or Filipino males as the main characters in these comics, they're not necessarily meant to be me, but representative of my experiences and other experiences I want to highlight. So what is sinigang? It's a popular dish in Filipino cuisine, a pork stew with a deliciously sour and savory taste, most often associated with tamarind. And it was, and is, my favorite Filipino dish. But in the second panel, where a white kid authoritatively declares that my food stinks, you can see why loving sinigang was difficult. Now in Asian American spaces, this is what's called a lunchbox or lunchroom moment. It has a name because it's just that common for Asian Americans and other people of color, especially first or second generation immigrants, to be treated this way. To me, unpacking this lunchbox moment was an incredibly important first step in beginning my journey to examine my Asianness and ultimately embrace it. It also helped deepen my understanding of the many issues affecting Asian Americans. For example, a year later, I made a sequel of this comic called Susmea Osit, where the subject matter is a little more complex. So the first panel is a lunchroom moment where we left off, and in the second panel, you see the white kids grow up to then become the arbiters of the sinigang dish they previously condemned, which brings up the issues of appropriation, gentrification, and of course, sweet, sweet irony. And if you're not Filipino and wondering what the pun of the title is, it's a phrase based on Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. For Filipinos, it's a versatile exclamation used to express fear, surprise, or frustration. At the time of this comic, most of the people who followed my previous work didn't really know I was Filipino, or even Asian. Some of them were poked and began to unfollow my pages, which terrified me. Because I was essentially prohibited from building networks when I worked with my brother, I was afraid I was losing what little I had left. And I thought, if these Lunar Brothers fans left, then I truly had nothing. But then I realized, if these fans require my erasure and acquiescence to racism in order to stay, then they were never really fans of mine. They were fans in spite of my Asianness, not because of it. And deep down, I knew that's exactly why I had avoided touching on these issues in my early career. Back then, I felt pressured to identify not as Asian or a Filipino creator, but an American creator, unhyphenated, with no racial or ethnic qualifier. I'm still proud of my work because I did put so much of myself in it, yet as you may have noticed, I never really depicted anyone close to myself in my comic books. You probably also noticed I did, however, explore other issues instead, like gender and disability, and featured female protagonists and heroes multiple times. I believe that universal themes meant depicting white people only. So where did this belief come from? Like most beliefs, it's taught to us. We're taught to not think about race, but I learned it thinks a lot about us. I began to realize how much my racialized identity played a part in my life circumstances. Which brings us to assimilation, a process that begins externally, but always makes its way into our homes. The thing is, I actually grew up immersed in Filipino culture. Because so many Filipinos joined the Navy, I often went to Phil-Am functions on base, my friends were Filipinos, my mom cooked Filipino food, my parents spoke Tagalog, a Filipino language. But there was always a delineation of how we lived and what I should aspire to. I was born light-skinned, so I have a strange relationship with the topic of colorism, because I was constantly judged and even bullied about being pale by people of color, so I never felt like it was a privilege. But at the same time, when I hear about the global prevalence of skin bleaching in Asian countries, and how normalized it is for Filipinos and other Asians to hate their brown skin, I understand that ultimately, bullying aside, light skin is institutionally prized over dark skin again and again. And it's created this very sad, very unnecessary fear of the sun, of the natural process of the skin producing more melanin to protect itself. And if that weren't enough, our noses are being judged too, to the point where we try to mutilate them, whether it's with our fingers or with our scalpels from plastic surgeries. Growing up, adults would constantly try to pinch mine, and I always hated it. Before I posted this comic, I didn't really see anyone in the Asian community talking about nose pinching openly. But when I posted this comic online, it was like the floodgates opened. So many Filipinos and other Asians were commenting and messaging me about how seen they felt. Some of the most common responses I got were, "We had the same childhood. I didn't know anyone else experienced this. I still pinch my nose to this day. I actually have permanent nose damage because of this." And this was one of the moments I realized that these comics, which were originally meant as a therapeutic journey just for me, were becoming a therapeutic journey for others too. A communal catharsis, one that made me and so many others feel less alone. But one of the reasons it's so hard to talk about these issues is because even our language is policed. For example, my parents made it a point to never teach me Tagalog, for fear of ruining my chances of having a perfect English accent. And they did that because they faced discrimination and racism, and you, me, and my brother would too. So many Filipinos, like my family, are taught the message that in order to be accepted by American society, we must assimilate. And by assimilate, that basically means aspiring to whiteness, even if that means hurting ourselves or other people of color. We're taught to distance ourselves, refusing to consider them as friends or potential romantic partners, thinking that maybe we won't be treated the same way if we stay away. The end result of all this is that I learned to be embarrassed of my Filipino-ness. I was trained to compartmentalize and inhabit two minds, yet still hate both, and it was all subconscious and deeply embedded. You can probably see now why therapy was really necessary, right? But before we place all the blame on Asian parents, which unfortunately is something that a lot of Asian Americans and even non-Asians are guilty of, let's go back and address the root causes of these mindsets and behaviors, because they don't come from nowhere. This comic demonization plays off of the 7 sins. For most of my life, I couldn't put a face to these demons, but that doesn't help stop them from poking you with little pitchforks and prodding and tempting you to sell your soul. Only after naming a thing can you begin to exercise it. These demons basically represent interlocking structures of oppression in America and how we're conditioned to absorb their messaging. So what are these demons? The first demon is a sloth demon in the top right, taking the form of a cop trying to hide police brutality against black people. You probably noticed that in the previous comic, Assimilation, the faceless hand said to date white people only and not date Asians or black people. In the same way, the sloth demon encourages passivity in the face of injustice against black people and other people of color. This is just one example, as state violence comes in many forms, to include how indigenous people's land rights and treaties are constantly violated, how the Muslim ban racializes and demonizes an entire religion, and how ICE terrorizes and or cages immigrants and undocumented people of color, such as Latinos and Southeast Asians. So the pride demon, in the form of a Klan member, redirects our attention to the model minority, the so-called whiz kids. These demons don't want Asian Americans to see ourselves in the shared struggle with people of color against white supremacy. So they recruit us into adopting their model of white pride, which ascribes traits onto race that we know are not real and based on bogus race science. The next demon is the envy demon, a plastic surgeon holding up the idealized image of a white male and offering it as a substitute for the Asian face. It tells us that the reason we don't see positive, meaningful Asian American representation in media is because we don't deserve it. Because only a white face deserves to be seen and desired. So if you want to be treated as human, you have to look more white. But don't stop there. The lust demon tells you to view women as sex objects. If your Asianness is an obstacle, at least you can still bro bond and participate in misogyny. But make sure that you still idolize whiteness as the best. Then there's the greed demon of capitalism, convincing you that hating yourself, other Asians, and other people of color is profitable. It makes itself look benevolent by tossing you a few coins while hiding the fact that it will always have the whole bag. The gluttony demon relates back to repent your sinigang and susme osip, and how we're encouraged to abandon our beloved cultural dishes and replace them with manufactured mystery meat, packed with chemicals, preservatives, and MSG, but the good kind because it's not Chinese food, obviously. Wink. And last but not least, there's the wrath demon in the middle, known as good old Uncle Sam. As I mentioned earlier, the pressure to identify as an unhyphenated, unracialized American is strong. The wrath is the promise that America delivers if you don't erase yourself. You either get the eraser or the pointy end, your choice. Overall, I want to make clear that the point of this comic isn't to demonize Asians as more toxic than anyone else, because the idea that Asians are inherently bigoted or more bigoted than any other group is in fact a racist concept. Anyone is susceptible to becoming a vehicle for harm, period. Asians are not special in this. I'm focusing on Asian issues only because that is the experience I can speak for, and because I want to address the specific forms of white supremacy and how it takes on to manipulate and harm Asian Americans. So while we're thinking about these various forms, it's important to remember to attribute their origins to the white supremacist structures that have a vested need to label, dehumanize, villainize, and divide people of color. And one of the biggest, most effective ways white supremacy perpetuates this kind of damaging messaging is through what's called the model minority myth. How many times have you heard comments like these? Asian Americans are doing better than white people. Asian Americans need to acknowledge their privilege. Asian Americans are basically white. The model minority myth is a falsehood created by white supremacy that implies Asians are inherently privileged due to our race, and therefore don't suffer from white supremacy. It is used as a wedge not only against other communities of color, but as a wedge within our own community, erasing the most marginalized amongst us, which includes poor or less educated Asians, undocumented Asians, dark-skinned Asians, and Southeast Asians. Asian Americans are the most economically divided race group in the US, which is why you usually hear about crazy rich Asians, but not brown Asians who are treated as a servant class all over the world, even to other Asians. Ultimately, the purpose of the model minority concept is to flatten the experiences of Asian Americans into a monolith in order to conceal our struggles and put a cap on our successes. For example, what you see in the right panel is very similar to my own high school experience, which felt more like a prison than a place of learning, let alone higher learning. An Asian American recently critiqued one of my comics, saying I couldn't possibly know what anti-Asian racism was because I didn't have a PhD. Sadly, this is not an isolated event, but a symptom of a pervasive mindset. The model minority myth has been propagated so effectively that even Asians have internalized this idea that without credentials or a certain pedigree, we have no say over our own lived experiences as people of color. So usually, when people say Asian Americans have Asian privilege, they are intentionally or unintentionally referring to privileges such as class, education, light skin, white passing, or actual white privilege, such as white mixed Asians like the Asians seen in the left panel here. So when discussing the privileges Asians might have, it is important to be specific and not inadvertently perpetuate a white supremacist narrative that harms Asians and other people of color by suggesting that Asianness has been anything but vilified domestically and abroad, socially and through government policy. One of the reasons why the myth and other forms of anti-Asian racism are so hard to dismantle is because white supremacy rewards Asian Americans who internalize this messaging with power to enforce that system. And these complicit Asians get defensive or even aggressive when it's pointed out. So what does that kind of reward system look like? Now I'm sure you can take a guess what inspired this comic, but to be clear, all of my comics take inspiration from my personal experiences and expand outward to see how they fit into a broader pattern. And the top-down system of exploitation shown here is just one of the many and can be found in all kinds of industries and job settings. So the question is, if white supremacy hates people of color so much and wants to keep us down, why would they ever let us take positions of power at any level? The answer lies in the concept of the token. Everyone here can point to an incident almost every day where a marginalized person with clout betrays their community like this. You can also notice how quickly white supremacy ousts them from their conditional token positions if they ever become inconvenient and lose their effectiveness as a token. So here we see the person at the bottom, laboring in miserable conditions and handing off their work for little pay and recognition to the token above him. The token in the middle panel serves several purposes. One, to insulate white-controlled institutions from accusations of discrimination. Two, to prove that hard work is sufficient to overcome structural inequality. And three, to keep as many other Asians and people of color out as possible, especially those who would question the institution. But the token is really just a smokescreen for the ugly truth. In a white supremacist world, all Asians and other people of color, including the token, are disposable. Asian creatives and other creatives of color aren't seen as talents to be nurtured, but a product to be extracted and credited to someone else. Tokenism creates so much damage, both interpersonally and institutionally, creating fissures and distrust in marginalized communities. And this relates back to the issue of mental health, which brings us to the topic of intergenerational trauma. There's a study that says Asian Americans are 3 times less likely to seek mental health help than white people, yet are more likely than white American students to have had suicidal thoughts and to attempt suicide. In 2017, suicide was the leading cause of death for Asian Americans ages 15 to 24, an age category which describes some of you in the audience today. So what's the cause behind the overwhelming prevalence of mental illness and the stigma against it in Asian American communities? One of the issues that is often overlooked or avoided is the prevalence of Asian Americans who inherit the trauma that comes from imperialism, war, colonization, displacement, and racism. Most Americans don't know that the Philippines has been colonized not only by Spain, but the US too, which brutally suppressed Filipino efforts towards independence and murdered to 1 million civilians to force the country into submission. The initial trauma is damaging enough, but when left untreated, it has the added effect of passing on to subsequent generations via epigenetic inheritance and learned behaviors, such as repressing emotions, poor communication and conflict resolution, verbal, emotional, and/or physical abuse, and ignoring or downplaying experiences of American racism in order to assimilate. Sometimes my parents would reveal fragments of their childhoods, mostly to instill guilt, as they recalled the horrors my grandparents suffered under Japanese invasion and occupation during the Second World War. My parents would also recall the emotional and physical abuse they endured from my grandparents, and never recognized the irony when they would repeat those patterns when I expressed anything less than eternal gratitude for the sacrifices they made to offer me a life and opportunities they were denied. They also never realized that the type of opportunities they expected me to have in America were part of the same cycle. You may have noticed the U.S. Naval Base sign in panel 1, and now there's a sign on the fridge in this panel that says, "Proud Navy Family." Ever since the U.S. colonized the Philippines, it has recruited Filipinos into its military ranks with the promise of a better life. That's why my dad encouraged me to enlist, just like he did. While not pro-enlistment, my mom echoed a similar sentiment, praising the virtues of America and the dream it promised, while sharply condemning anything Filipino-related, a warning to never look back at what they left behind. So let's think about that. The U.S. is responsible for devastating exploiting the Philippines, and say they want to rescue Filipinos from the damage, but only if we go and do to other countries what was done to the Philippines. As I said earlier, we can't blame Asian parents for everything, because we're all just as capable of replicating this behavior. This panel shows an imagined future where the adult perpetuates the cycle of telling the child to work hard, keep their head down, not complain, and rely on exceptionalism to save the family and repay their sacrifices, which leaves the child voiceless and alone as they try to navigate the pressure cooker by themselves, all in the name of chasing the American dream. But it doesn't have to be this way. Through dialogue and healing, we can break the cycle. So how do we do that? For me, the answer I found was, you guessed it, doodling. America teaches us to believe that society is colorblind, yet I grew up saturated in whiteness. There wasn't much Asian American representation, especially anything positive. We're all familiar with the wimpy geeks and faceless goons for white heroes to defeat, the delicate geisha and fiery dragon lady, the Fu Manchu, and so on, and how yellowface, brownface, and whitewashing are all seen as acceptable substitutes for casting actual Asians. In every case, the purpose is to dehumanize Asians, to strip us of our voice. This meant that I grew up cheering on white heroes on television or film, even when they were mowing down Asian males that looked like me with bullets or bombs. During college, my fellow art students, my professors, even the life drawing models were predominantly white. That bled into my art, and I even bleached my hair blonde and wore colored contacts for a while. So by the time I entered the comic industry as a professional, I didn't even need to be told that the so-called best comics were written by white people, specifically white men, and were about white characters. The training is deliberate and goes far beyond what's taught in art schools. It's a legacy of anti-Asian propaganda that goes back to the Chinese Exclusion Act, U.S. colonization of the Philippines, Japanese-American internment, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the secret wars in Laos and Cambodia, and more. After all, it's a lot harder to justify violence against Asians if we're allowed to be seen as human. So for my journey of self-love to be complete, I had to humanize myself. I had to draw not just someone who looked like me, but to draw myself, my own face. I should mention that many of the comics have resulted in racist harassment, but this comic received some of the worst harassment from white Nazis who defaced this panel with swastikas, images of Hitler, and horrible slurs and other imagery directed at marginalized people that I won't repeat here. It's true that when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. But part of my journey was learning that you don't have to make yourself smaller for anyone, no matter who they are. And if they can't accept you for you, it's not you who needs to feel ashamed, but them. And I also learned to look beyond the Asian American experience and extend solidarity with other people of color, women, neurodivergent and disabled people, and the LGBTQ community. It's important to not only honor our unique experiences and struggles, but to also see how we're linked under systems of oppression and bigotry, and the shared struggle this creates. So clearly I poured a lot of myself into these strips that took on a life of their own for these past few years, organically growing into a communal therapeutic journey for me and others. As the comics resonated strongly with all kinds of people, these strips were never meant to become a book at all, but when educators and other fans asked for a book collecting these strips so they could share them or teach them in classrooms, I realized I wanted to make this my priority project instead. So last year, I decided to submit it to Image as Americanization, a Filipino-American comic creator's awakening, and submitted this as the cover. Unfortunately, despite having published with Image Comics for 10 plus years and having all of my previous projects enthusiastically greenlit with little editorial oversight or pushback, they not only rejected Americanization, but did so in a way that made it clear that talking about race as honestly as I do was completely unwelcome at the company. The partner I pitched this to, who was a white man, described my comics as angry and suggested that I wasn't talking about the Asian American experience in the right way. He not only cited Asians on his staff, but he even brought up his wife, who's half Japanese, to justify him saying this. Yet, this company has no problem publishing and even going out of their way to defend and praise books that have depicted violent imagery and narratives that harm the trans community and people of color, including Asians. I'm often asked why I went public, instead of quietly trying to find a new publisher. The answer is that although I'm proud of my previous works, and I'm happy they resonated with so many people all around the world, I spent too many years of my career being erased, and I wasn't going to let that happen again. For the first time in my career, I wasn't just pitching a story, I was pitching my own humanity. Fighting for this book's right to exist and be published is an act of self-love. But it's not easy. I still haven't found a new publisher to this day, and some days it's hard to find the motivation to keep going. But I know refusing to back down is the right thing to do. I know this because I'm not the only person who's been taught they don't deserve to be seen. I think of all the young Asian Americans and other marginalized people who, in this very moment, are learning to erase themselves and tolerate abuse because they think that's the best they can get. Discussions of racism and other structural oppression can sometimes get so intellectualized that we often forget that at its core, it's simply abuse. And abuse is a universal language. So this is my reminder to myself and to others like me that we don't have to accept that. We shouldn't strive for a colorblind world, but a world where we acknowledge and honor the beautifully diverse palette of color we see in real life, where Filipinos, other Asians, and people of color, and other marginalized people get to be ourselves and be loved for it. We deserve a world where we get to love ourselves out loud and proudly put ourselves back in the picture. And we shouldn't have to wait or ask permission to do so. Thank you. comics or follow me on social media, you can head to any of these links. I believe we now have time for some questions.
Thank you so much for coming. These stories actually really inspiring.
Well, thank
I
you.
just wanted to ask, what would you tell college students or people who are trying to break generational cycles of trauma and still are trying to find these outlets or ways of expressing those repressed emotions or thoughts about it?
Thank you. Well, for me personally, it was art, and I know everyone has a talent, their own unique talents, and their own way of expressing themselves, and so everyone has their journey. But I think at the end of the day, it's important to just express it and find a safe place to talk about it, because when this stuff stays inside you, it can become so toxic that if you let it out in a healthy way. So I think the key is just to talk about it with someone and get it out. Either that's a therapist or a friend you can trust. But yeah, question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
My name is Audrey. I'm a senior here. Thank you so much for coming. So I'm currently taking a incredible class for Japanese pop culture, and we were just talking about manga this week, and I just wanted to ask you if you've ever thought of breaking into that realm and maybe trying to do your important work in that realm.
What, you mean like anime?
No, I mean like maybe because you were saying that you couldn't find like a publisher here.
Oh.
Yeah, like trying to seek other.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess because I'm just so used to publishing in America, it didn't really occur to me to venture out in that route, because there's also language barriers and stuff. But I'd be interested, excited to talk to anyone who's interested in my work. But thank you. That's interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
David Leibowitz, sophomore.
Hello.
Your story was very inspiring.
Oh, thank you.
Although not a personal reader of comics, what is your general advice to the media industry, including comics, movies, video games, all that, in America for depiction, how they can better the depiction of Asians in that culture?
Oh, just for the comic book industry itself, or
Comic
media?
industry.
Media, yeah. I actually did call out, the current editor of Marvel, because he had a past of, writing in yellowface, and I thought that was just it sent such a message when you hire a person who had a career, because he's a white guy who had a pen name called Akira Yoshida for years, and that's just fine. And so I think the industry has a long way to go. I mean, as you can see the reaction to my pitch, it was shocking, because it was a publisher that I had a working relationship with for 10 plus years, and all the previous books pitches were supported and greenlit almost like it was clear that they needed no samples, or because they were familiar with my work. So I really think the industry is not ready to have that conversation, and I want to make this book so we can get that moving.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Julie. I'm a senior, and I'm also Filipino.
Oh.
I
Filipinos domestically? And how would you, the Philippines now currently suffers from a lot of systemic breakdown that I believe is a relic of colonialization and ongoing impacts of colonialization in the Philippines. I'm wondering how you use your art or your activism to kind of relate those two experiences.
The first question was how Filipino Americans relates. I'm sorry, one more time.
Yeah, I'm wondering how you use your art or your activism to relate the experiences of Filipino Americans in the United States with Filipinos domestically in the Philippines right now.
Yeah, I feel like it's not really my lane to talk about Filipinos in the Philippines because I don't live there, and I have some thoughts, like, some opinions, but sometimes I feel like because I'm not in that space and living that experience, I don't have maybe not even the expertise to talk about it. But there's a lot to talk about, sure. Yeah.
My name is Seth Sherwood. I'm a sophomore, and I really related to your story of like being an Asian American military child. I actually was one as well, and I ended up in Virginia after my dad's service as well. I just wanted to ask, like, how would you, if you had any advice for like navigating the landscape? So I'm a half and half kid. I'm half white, half Korean, and I wanted to know, like, if you had any advice for my role in kind of like a racialized society as someone who's like a minority and a minority at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, just being like minority within a minority for Asians.
Say that again.
You said how to navigate as an Asian.
As like a half and half kid specifically.
Oh,
kind of like a little bit of an awkward position.
I feel that's out of my lane too. It's like, I don't know. That's such a a personal experience. Like, but I think I empathize with the struggle because even me as a Filipino, I think I have some form of that because I was always told I don't look Filipino, and so I always look more Chinese. That's the first thing you think of, and it shows a spectrum of how different Filipinos can look because there's just a long history of muddle kind of stuff like that, and but I think it's important just to find people that you share that experience with, and just like it helps to talk about it, and so just like find your own people, and yeah.
Thank you so much.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Carrie. I'm a first year here. So I guess my question is, like, personally, as an American, Asian American, how do you like find a way to like fit in a predominantly like non-Asian background?
Like white dominated society.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, like from my talk, you can see I did it the wrong way. But like, I don't know if there's the right way to do it because it's we're all kind of navigating this society with no rule book. We just kind of have to, diasporic Asians and other people of color just kind of have to, sometimes find out the hard way. You kind of learn as you go, and there's a lot of, so it's a bumpy road. But I wish I could give advice, but like it's almost contradictory because I would say like, oh, know who you are, but then sometimes you don't know who you are until you face that adversity and those moments where your I don't know, character or your sense of self is challenged. So it's the hard part is just like keep going, and but it's definitely hard. I think that should be acknowledged, sure.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alex. I teach here sometimes, and thank you very much for your talk. This is one of the bravest things I've seen on this stage in the 4 years I've been here.
Thank you.
So I have two questions. One is, in 1979, I was in 6th grade and benefiting from white privilege and being gifted and all that stuff. And one of my teachers organized a thing where we would learn about the Japanese internment. And part of that was listening to a woman testify. And we were told not to ask any questions or anything, just let her talk. We went into the library. And then I was stunned when I went in the room and I saw my mom's friend. I'd been to her house and she'd been to our house. And so it got real personal real quick that, you know, someone I know had been oppressed by my government that I thought was pretty cool until then.
Wow.
And so I guess my question is, have you or can you do this sort of thing in middle schools? Because I think 6th and 7th graders really need to hear your message. I heard that testimony when I was 11, and I think that went a long way towards me evolving into an ally that it's an ongoing work that I need to do. And then my second question is raising two very white boys who read manga and comics and stuff. I want to buy your thing. Can you self-publish that? And
I'm looking for a publisher. It's all a difficult situation because it kind of threw the whole plan off kilter.
Yeah.
Getting rejected by Image. So it's been this weird journey of like I'm making strips, I'm putting them up online, and I'm posting them, but with no real promise of if it's getting published or whatever. But I'm just finding my way. Not sure if I'm gonna self-publish or find a publisher, or I'm just kind of like, because being with Flash for 10 years,
yeah.
you get used to it, and then but maybe it's a good thing to find something new. But yeah.
We're at 12:30.